Now let me introduce our guest. I have a rather strange rule that I observe, which is that I never, ever will address any elected official by their first name. When Jerry Sanders was mayor, a good friend, I always called him Mr. Mayor. One day I asked my wife, why does he do that? He can call me Jerry. She said, no, he won't do that, and I don't. I've been a friend of the vice president's for 44, 45 years. I've never, ever called him Joe. And when our son Tim went to work for him as an intern at the U.S. Senate, we had to keep telling him, Tim, you can't call him Joe. Some senators want you to call them by their names, but that's just a rule that I observe. And in the case of Mike Dukakis, who is a genuinely close and beloved friend, the same thing. So, however, as it relates to our guest today, since I've known her forever, and since she asked me to introduce her when she ran for the school board, and because she's a neighbor, and because it is somewhat awkward to say Congresswoman Davis, right? So I think she's okay if I call her Susan. Or as I sometimes call her, St. Susan, because she's just fantastic. Welcome, please, from the United States House of Representatives, just back from Washington, Congresswoman Susan Davis.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. It's really nice to be here. And, you know, George is such an icon that in a way I should probably call him Mr. Mitrovich. But, but to me, he's George as well. A good friend, a neighbor, and someone who I think is so connected to San Diego. When you think about San Diego, and certainly the City Club is all about that, but it's someone who has been so engaged and knows people at so many in so many different ways. I mean, multiple ways, the same person, but in so many different roles, and really the diversity of San Diego that, you know, we love it that everyone wants to be George's friend, and it means a great deal to me, for me to be here, for you to have asked me to be here. And I just wanted to tell you a very brief story, because I thought George might do this. But some of you may recall, I don't know how many of the students here recall it, I love being around young people. Maybe that makes me feel younger. But to remind you, in 2009, in the summer of 2009, I don't know how many of you remember what was going on then, but the administration and certainly the Congress had put forth what people call Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, and and people around the country, unknowns to a lot of us, had been organizing to create havoc at a lot of town halls around the Affordable Care Act. And we, earlier in the year, had sort of mapped out a number of town hall meetings, which we do, and one of them happened to be out in Spring Valley. We were just gonna hold it at the library. But it hit in August of 2009. And fortunately for us, the Park and Recreation gym was across the way, so that we could certainly expand that program for the number of people who would choose to be there. And it was very clear to us that we were going to have a nicely attended event, nicely attended, going from what ordinarily would be probably about 40 to 50 people coming to the town hall meeting to 1,200 at least. And so I realized that in order to make this work, there needed to be somebody up there besides myself trying to manage the audience. And so, who did I call? George, you can imagine. And it gave me, and I think the 70-plus sheriffs in the audience who were there, both in uniform and undercover. I think a lot of them wanted overtime, but still they were there, and we were glad they were there. An opportunity to really have what people have said was a very well-managed meeting, considering the emotional level of the people who attended, of course, and just the sheer numbers of people and the questions that we were trying to answer. So I couldn't have done it with George, and he knows that I owe him one every time, and I'll always be there for him. Thanks to all of you, of course, for being here, to La Jolla Country Day students as well as bishops, but I have to say, everybody tells me that if I don't mention the fact that girls basketball is doing well at La Jolla Country Day, that I'll definitely get in trouble. And the other thing I wanted to say, because I met his dad just a few minutes ago, Brandon Mendoza, one of the great alums from La Jolla Country Day, works with me and is really an exceptionally skilled and a wonderful member of our staff in Washington. And I also have with me today Armida, who is with us in San Diego, who is also just a wonderful addition to the staff. And our team Davis has always been about trying to do everything that we can for the community. And everybody comes with that idea. I don't think people really appreciate the amount of casework that comes out of an office every single year. I don't think I understood that actually congressional offices are sort of a last stop for people when they're having difficulty with the federal government. I mean, getting through the morass of laws and regulations, and certainly when it comes to Social Security and immigration, the two issues that we hear the most about. And that's what staff is very, very good at. So when people ask me very detailed questions about case management, I also have to tell them, I'm really sorry. I don't live in that world every single day. I don't deal, with the nitty-gritty that my staff does, but they can help you. And that's basically why we're so pleased to really have that opportunity. And it's one of the great parts of this job that I think is least talked about in the community. I come out of a history of social work. That's really where I started when I began thinking about what I wanted to do when I grew up, probably from the time I was in high school and then through college. I never expected to be in politics. That was not something that I thought about or sought. But as George and others here know, and certainly the Boyles who are here, that I actually ran for the school board kind of unexpectedly. A friend of mine who I thought was running, and I was trying to help her out because I'd been in League of Women Voters and I knew a little bit about campaigning and I'd been involved in a few races. And at the last minute, she decided not to run, really the last minute, and I jumped into that. And I am so grateful in many ways that I was at that place at that time, that I could take advantage of the short time period and run for the school board, which I thoroughly enjoyed, even when I had people outside my house picketing for a chance at a better budget and for really better conditions for all the wonderful educational leaders that we have in our district. And so that's really where things began for me. One of the things that I want to talk about today, because it's certainly, the elephant in the room here, and something that I'm sure is on everyone's mind, is we just had an election. And I'm not here to provide any real partisan slant to that election whatsoever, but there are some things, you have to deal in facts, right? And the fact is that there was a bit of a landslide in this election, and something probably people didn't quite anticipate. One of the big problems with the election is not a lot, it's like we threw a party and nobody decided to come. It was just announced this morning, I think I heard 42% was the turnout in California as a whole, but it was 33% in San Diego County. Lots and lots of people stayed home. Now, that's not unusual for a midterm election, people don't identify with midterm elections. And I want to talk a little about the millennials and sort of the response that they had. But I think, and this is something that I know I've heard and I think you all can relate to, the only election in which people believe they have a personal investment and stake, generally speaking, for all the population, is the presidency. You know, the president is somebody who is personal to us. Very, very personal to us. I think this is probably long-standing in this country. Maybe I'm going to take a little side detour here and tell a brief story, because I was always touched by this story as well. And I know George knows this story, I'm sure, but others may. It really tells of the day when, after Franklin Roosevelt passed away, he died, and of course the country wanted to salute him. They wanted to pay tribute to him. And so as the train moved throughout the countryside, there is a story of a reporter who was watching a gentleman who was really crying hard as the president came by, and the reporter asked him, seeing him, "Sir," he said, "I can see how upset you are. Did you know President Roosevelt?" And the gentleman looked at him and said, "No, I didn't know President Roosevelt, but he knew me." And that was the attachment, that was the feeling that people had. And I think today as well, people might argue it's not the same for many people today. And in fact, we know that there certainly are people who are not happy at any point in our local history with the president, but it is a personal relationship. And so in many ways, I think that partly explains what happens in midterm elections, but there are a lot of other things going on. For young people, there was about 22% of millennials 18 to 32 or so who voted. So far less than the rest of the population, but not different from prior midterm elections. That was pretty much standard in terms of where they are, and we have to ask ourselves, you know, can't we do better? I mean, that is not good for this country, and it's certainly not good for the voices that are not being heard because young people are not responding. So that's really important. The Republicans actually won 12 more seats in the House, and their total is now 246 seats overall, and they picked up 9 seats in the Senate. Now we can all ask ourselves, did they win because they had great ideas, better ideas, or because people were just frustrated with the way things were, or because there was nobody distinguished between who had one way of looking at government and another way of looking at government. And I'm sure you all have some ideas about that. Why do you all think, and I'll ask some questions and we'll come back, you know, why so many people didn't vote? Is it they watched too many nasty commercials? Or again, they never saw anybody putting forth a plan, a reason that they should vote? I think a lot of us explain why people didn't get involved because they're fed up with government somewhat, but they're also fed up with the money in government. And that plays a role as well. We know that Citizens United has really had an effect on this country because basically it not just opened up all the rules, but basically threw away a lot of the rules about how people contribute. And one of the most important things that we've seen, certainly here in California, is that having transparency, knowing where money is coming forth when people vote. There was an environmental issue a few years ago, and we actually knew that the very people who were promoting it were the very people who were causing the problem. And so sometimes, you know, that can help you out. But under what's happening now, people just don't know, and they can't distinguish between a candidate's ad and a special interest ad. It's very difficult to do that. And we had over $4 billion spent in this last election. Imagine that. That was a midterm election. $4 billion. I have met several colleagues who lost the election who were exceptionally good members, really, and yet they had, $2 and $3 million thrown into the race in about the last 3 weeks of the election. There's no way people can compete with that. People spend far too much time, from where I come from, raising money throughout the course of 2 years before they run again. But when this happens at the last minute, it's almost impossible for people to really deal with that. So how do we move forward? Where do we go from here? Well, one of the things I want to say, because people ask me a lot, how do you work with a lot of the members of Congress? And the reality is, with the exception of a few, I actually do believe that most people who come to Congress, who maybe have legislative careers and maybe not, although the bulk of them have, they really come because they want to do good things for their country and for their community. They have a different way of looking at it. They may believe that less government is better, but nevertheless, and people can have that point of view, and it can be a very legitimate one, but they do come wanting to do a good job, and we all actually develop relationships with people with whom we agree on very few basic things. It's kind of hard to believe, but now and then I meet couples, and I call it a mixed marriage. I sometimes have difficulty understanding when my friends will tell me that they know they all cancel out their votes in a family, and that they really kind of disagree, basically, on a lot of things that happen and basic issues that we all need to engage in. And there's a lot of disagreement in families. That's why Thanksgiving and holidays and places like that are a time that people can listen to their relatives even though they don't agree with them. And in many ways, it's the same thing in the Congress, because there are people that I have to work with who I really don't agree with on many things, but I have to find a way to do that. I just was at a bipartisan dinner the other day, a small one at a member's home. And I can tell you that the discussion around the table was actually a very cordial one. And people were sharing some of their frustrations about their own parties. And that's a good thing. But unfortunately, when you move out of that environment and you have leadership and many, many other groups who influence members, it gets a little trickier. You have to get back and remember that a lot of people are making decisions based upon their districts, just like I make decisions based upon my district and the community and the region of San Diego, which I think is really critical in terms of our ability to do what's best for the next generation that's coming forward. So they're making decisions that way too, and those of us in California begin to realize that we really do live in a kind of bubble, and that the majority of people who serve in the Congress, we always have to remember, they don't come from communities like San Diego or even on the East Coast like New York. They come from Middle America. And for many of them, the largest community that they serve and maybe live in is about 5,000 people. We have 5,000 people in Kensington. Think about that, It makes a difference in the way people feel and the way that they are exposed to issues. So that when we fight for the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, for example, and I'm talking to my colleagues on the Armed Services Committee, and I have to ask them a little bit about their exposure to people who maybe have a different lifestyle than they do. And in many cases, they have no familiarity with that, which is very different from my experience and from the experience, I'm sure, of everybody here. We have to find a way to do this, though, and that's really at the heart, I think, of what happens, and we actually have a teachable moment going on right now in the Senate, as we did yesterday in the House. And there are always tough choices, and I'm happy to share that with you. What is important, I think, is for Congress to stay engaged and to not shy away from being in communities where maybe everybody doesn't agree with them. The difficulty is, as you can imagine, there are some members who really don't have to face people often in their communities who disagree with them. And that's why the election process and districting plays a really big role in this. Because if districts are created in a way different from, California now has a commission, but most districts have legislatures, which is why it's so important when legislatures turn as well, when they're not very well balanced, because then you have a legislature that determines how to draw those lines. And people are going to draw the line so they don't have to face a very diverse electorate. And that's why it's been very difficult, and I don't anticipate that we're going to see many changes until the next census and the next redistricting for the Congress. One of the things the issues that I would share with you, and I'd love to get your input, and we'll have questions in just a second, is the role of young people and voting. Here at La Jolla Country Day, and I'm sure at Bishop's as well, you have a civic education program that engages you, I hope, and I'm anticipating you do because we're all here right now. That doesn't happen everywhere. And one of the things that we know about millennials now is they're very, very engaged in community service, partly because they have great community service learning programs at their schools. But they still are not that interested in voting. I happened to be at the library school on Election Day down in San Diego, and I don't know if many of you are familiar, but we have a new school there which draws students from all over. I figured, there's something I could do about the election early on Tuesday morning, and so I was there, and we had a number of students, and most of them were about 17 years old, actually, because they weren't quite 18 yet. And I asked them, if you were eligible today to vote, would you vote? How many here, everybody, a lot of you eligible to vote or not eligible to vote? But if you had been eligible to vote, are you willing to tell me? Would you have voted? You think you would? How many think you wouldn't? You wouldn't bother, you wouldn't go. You may not feel comfortable voting. Maybe you're not willing to tell me. Well, for some reason, when I was there at the class, quite surprisingly, I asked this question. And most of the students raised their hand and said that they would not have voted. And I asked them, well, why wouldn't you have voted? And they basically said they were afraid they would make a mistake, that they couldn't distinguish between some of the people that were up for election. We know there was one kind of contentious race that actually affected most of this area. And they were confused, as I think many, many people are. So we really have to identify that and try and find our way through it. I mentioned earlier about community service learning and how pleased I am that we're all here today. And it is a surprising statistic, the number of young people today who are involved in their communities, very, very high, and the number of young people who choose not to vote. Thank you all so much for being here this morning, and we certainly will be opening up to questions, and I'm very, very happy to have you engage with me, and I'll get out here and we'll take this away. Oh, okay, so we'll do it. I'll stay here, okay.
I want to make, I just want to make a point. When the Congresswoman talked about caseworkers, I was the press secretary to Senator Charles Goodell of New York. I had one of the glamour jobs. There were 100 staffers. About 75 did casework. They did the really important stuff. And I had a conversation once with the editor of the Atlanta Constitution Journal, and I asked him, why don't you ever write about the members of the House and the Senate who do casework? Because it is so incredibly important. But I doubt that anyone in this room has ever read a story in a magazine or a newspaper about the staffs of members of Congress who do casework and who often become a lifesaver for some constituent who was getting nowhere with the federal government. It is so critical. Anyway, I was so glad you referenced that. Who would like to ask the first question? Yes, sir.
Oh, students.
No,
I'm
we
sorry.
will, we will,
Yeah,
we will.
okay, I want to be sure you all answer. Go ahead, sir. I'm
My father, like your father, World War II Navy. As of next month, I will have been on the Federal Employees Health Plan for 65 years. How many Republican members of Congress are not on the Federal Employees Health Plan?
Congresswoman, you'll need to repeat.
I really don't know.
There's actually one.
One.
Former Congressman Ben Quayle of Arizona was the only Republican member of Congress not to be on the health plan, but they all voted against Obama.
Right.
Do you want to just kind of summarize that?
You know, it's a little like what happened, and George knows when we were at the healthcare forum, because many people, and some of you may recall this, we had people who were really yelling, you know, keep government off my Medicare, keep your hands off my Medicare. And people had not made the connection, or either they made it and they didn't want to acknowledge it, that Medicare is a federal program, and it's a federal program that took a long time to come together. It wasn't something that just happened. And that's why I think, for myself personally, the fact that we have so many more people insured today than we had before the ACA is very significant. And I think we'll look back at this and we'll not see this period as such a long one as it feels living through it, because that is what happens. And it takes an incredible amount of time. Even the prescription drug benefit under Medicare, I was there the night that, you know, it took probably, 4 or 5 hours before we had a final vote on that. And people are just not ready. And then when it was implemented and when it was launched, there were so many problems. I'm not suggesting that the ACA, though, for everybody here, hasn't had its problems. It definitely has. And I think when you do something that big, that's going to happen. Some of them, though, should have been prevented and could have been prevented. And I think we all acknowledge that, and we want to improve it.
She's anxious for students to, yes.
Sorry, I'm not a student.
I know you're not, but you look like that.
So I have to say, I guess, first, I was really lucky to have been raised by parents who talked about the voting process and who talked about politics, because I couldn't wait to turn 18 to vote. My first election was also a contentious one. It was these two guys, Bush and Gore. But I have to say, I was really more excited that I'm from Massachusetts, that I was able to vote for Kennedy. Like, that was the most exciting thing for me, who was not running for president. But I think now, in the age of so much technology, Twitter, sound bites, short little blips, and so much information coming at people that it's just sound bites. And the young people don't know what's truth, what's half-truths, and what's not truth at all. Do you see a way, or do you know of something, have an idea of how we can get through this and get what's really accurate out there in a way that is not lost in the shuffle of all of these other sound bites that are not necessarily truth, or if they are, they just are out of context and don't make sense.
Yeah. Well, I think what you raise in terms of social media, there are so many ways that people get information today, and in some ways the good thing for, I think, a lot of young people is that they weren't watching television during this last midterm election, so they didn't necessarily have all the obnoxious ads that were out there. They perhaps had other lines of thought that were were not the same as what was on television. There are a lot of responsible organizations, especially when we have initiatives on the ballot, that are putting out good information. My history here in San Diego was when I arrived in 1972, we actually had been in Japan serving during the Vietnam War, and so we came to San Diego. I didn't know anybody here, and I hadn't really been familiar with San Diego. I grew up in Northern California, and I happened to be introduced to the League of Women Voters from a friend who was at the preschool where my children attended. And I got involved, and so I got very involved in something then, the Election Extra, which was out. Of course, now all that stuff's online, but in those days you actually passed it out, and you had all these meetings to try and bring together pro-con of all the initiatives. And they still exist, as do others. I think when you're interested in environmental issues, there are a host of organizations that can provide that point of view. You're not necessarily going to get a pro-con, but at least you can get, I think, some good information. So that is pretty much out there. The greater difficulty is individuals. And the best way, I think, to do that is to go on, everybody has a website now, so you really can make a contrast with, even though it's the information people are putting out, it is good information that represents that person. You may not agree with it, but it does represent that person's point of view. That's important. Working in people's offices who are running for office is, just like you said with Kennedy, is a great way to do that. And we have enthusiastic groups of young people. I know we certainly did, and I know we did here locally. Many, many young people that get involved in the races, and that's good. But people, it's just harder. I would agree with you. It's just a lot harder. And sometimes we just have to try and identify the best sources available. And if people are not watching television, which is probably a good thing during an election, then what are the sources? What are the print sources? What are the online sources, whether it's obviously we don't have a local paper here that's able to provide that, but there are other sources locally to do that. It takes time. It does take effort, and I think you can always do what I think we all do. What I do in the Congress every day is to go to the people who I see as more informed than I am about something. Doesn't mean they're expert, but it means that they either sit on a committee and they're more engaged in that, and they may have a point of view. Now, you don't have that body of folks to go to, but you do have experts here in San Diego. We have experts in the academic world. You can go to your professors. I don't think there's anything more flattering than to go online, find someone who's recommended in a certain area, and call that person up and say, I'm thinking about this piece of the election. I'd really like to know what you think. It's not easy. Takes a lot more work, but it's possible.
Sid, and then over here.
So recently we've seen from news sources that within the Democratic Party, there's been a sort of split between people like Congressman Peters, who are more moderate, versus Senator Warren, who's a more traditionally liberal. And we've also seen Democrats within the legislature attacking the president and vice versa. So could you comment on the apparent division within the Democratic Party? Or is there even one?
I'm happy to, and it's always great to have what we would all call a teachable moment, because it's in the present and everybody can identify with it, and it's not something that's out there. What happened in the Congress is something kind of typical in some ways. Over the last few years, and I've got some amazing statistics in terms of the Congress and what hasn't gotten accomplished, but the reality is that there is an effort to actually deliver on what we call the omnibus. They were calling it the omnibus because of the continuing resolution and sort of putting those two together, but to try and make certain that we actually passed bills that people felt in certain areas they wanted to increase the budget, and in other areas they wanted to get rid of something, and they wanted to, delete certain parts of the budget. What's been happening is these continuing resolutions, so you just do a status quo. And if you don't need the money, it's in there anyway. If you need money and you can't argue it. So that's harmful to our democracy. It's certainly harmful for the programs that I care about. What happened is usual too, that at the last minute in the negotiations over on the Senate side, they threw in a number of pretty onerous amendments, but two in particular. One dealt with Wall Street and one dealt with campaign finance reform. That was negotiated, not by one side or the other, together. They actually worked on a number of bills. And what had been happening in the appropriations process is they were getting rid of some pretty bad stuff. So there are a number of individuals that wanted to really open up what is the Dodd-Frank bill, which came about in response to the too big to fail issues around, the mortgages and risky loans and a whole host of issues that we know from 2008. And in order to get rid of some of the really, really, really bad stuff, they decided to go with something that they thought was less bad. And we end up with this all the time. And it's too bad, but honestly, it is part of the negotiating process. So when those two measures came back over to the House, in the Senate as well, who's for that? Nobody's for that. But what's the alternative? The alternative is a continuing resolution through February. So what does that mean? It means that people would go back in January, you'd have 12 new members of Congress on the Republican side. And I felt, and I think a lot of people felt, that we actually had an appropriations bill that was about as good as we could hope for. Bad stuff in it, but actually promoting climate change legislation and early childhood education, a lot of areas that people care about. And so that was really a dilemma. And our leader, Nancy Pelosi, along with really the entire, I think, most of the Democrats, needed to air that out. We were all upset about it. It was bad stuff. And it brought over the chief of staff of the president and a lot of phone calls coming over to the House. Now, on the other side, you have people who don't want to pass a budget bill. They're happy to bring down the government. And so there are a limited number of votes that they can find there. And you just have to, this is like, how would it, given that, think about how you would have reacted. I personally feel like it was very important for Democrats to make a very strong stand that this stuff is, junk. We don't support this. But on the other hand, if we had to face continuing resolutions and running a government 3 months at a time, it's crazy. And I don't think we would have even gotten 3 months out of this coming Congress to try and deal with that when we knew that we had other issues that we wanted to deal with. And could we come back under Dodd-Frank and do some other things that would really do something about too big to fail for banks that are, the problem with the bill that they had before us, just for those of you who aren't following it, it's fine for folks on Wall Street to engage in some risky stuff, but not at our expense, not with taxpayers' money. And so they were trying to pull this out of an area which you couldn't take you couldn't be covered or have the FDIC insure some of those risky loans versus an area where they existed. And so that's really what we were arguing about. And in the end, I think that the very, very close vote, a number of us, including myself and including Congressman Peters, really, I feared actually what could happen next if we had to go to those continuing resolutions and not be able to deal with the issues before us. Now, I really feel very, very strongly that we have to do everything that we can on other issues around Dodd-Frank and certainly on campaign finance. But the campaign finance piece was a little different than the money that people put into elections per se. It had more to do with the conventions and what the parties can do in terms of buying property and things like that. But it was really hard. How would you all, I mean, I'm guessing that a lot of people here would have said, just as a lot of my constituents have said to me, when I asked one time on a telephone town hall meeting, do you like it when, would you like me to compromise or would you like me not to compromise? And you know what people said? Don't compromise. We don't want you to compromise. Just hold on to your position. But sometimes you also have to look at the consequences of those moves. And this one, to me, was consequential. It wasn't just something that you didn't like. It was actually, how would that affect the very people who I work hard for every day? And if we begin and so it was even going forward, because if you have a continuing resolution, we would never be able to recoup some of the stuff in this budget bill. And it would just mean that we probably had a status quo budget for the next 2 years. And that, in the end, that just wasn't what I think we as a country needed to do.
I'll come to this. We're going to come back here, but I want to just, last night on the NewsHour, Mark Shields and David Brooks. Mark Shields talking about the vote, particularly with reference to Senator Warren's extremely effective and strong speech yesterday, calling out Citibank and naming all of the people, not only in the present government, but in the past government who are alums of Citibank, including the Treasury Secretary. So Mark Shields made the point, and I want to see whether you think this is a possibility. He made the point that while Citibank got their way in this bill, because they actually wrote the bill, going forward, there's going to be consequences to Citibank because so much attention has been called upon them in a negative way, and I just want to know whether you would concur with that.
I certainly hope that's the case. I think it's going to depend on a bipartisan effort to see that through. And in this case, it actually takes that, because being honest about it, it was not just Republicans who negotiated that bill, but Democrats as well. So we have to acknowledge that and see what can be done. One of the pieces of this bill that was really significant is a lot more money for oversight of these entities. There really hasn't been enough. And the training, so what you need is people in government who have far greater skills than private attorneys being paid millions of dollars, in these areas. And we have to compete with that. So that's the good part of it, that we can and should and hopefully will have better oversight, because we funded those entities who do that job and have that oversight to a greater extent than they've been funded in the past. That's what we have to do, and I think we have to do exactly what Senator Warren suggested, is come back and really take a look at Dodd-Frank. All the things that didn't happen. Some good stuff happened, but not enough, and I think everybody would agree that it did nothing to really stop the too big to fail aspect of many of our large banks, which have, by the way, merged. So they're even bigger today than they were then. And we have to do something about that. And that would be a great present to, all of us in the country, to have the Congress come together and do something about that. And so you have this odd alliance with Tea Partiers and people. I think Elizabeth Warren actually represents a lot of us, but I think that, again, it's that element of what comes next that concerns, I think, people like myself and others that felt that we couldn't win in this. It was such a lose-lose situation that in the end, you would really be stuck with a big problem. But I'd love to see legislation on Dodd-Frank.
Yes, back here.
Thank you for coming today.
Can you stand up so we can see you and speak up? Thank you.
Thank you for coming today. And what elements of immigration reform are the most important to you? And do you think that people that are working here illegally should be deported back to their country of origin?
Well, actually, did you say people who don't have papers that are working here? Well, I think what the president is doing with the limited authorization that he used is to cap deportations other than people who are carrying on activities that are not legitimate in the country. Now, I don't consider the fact that they're here and they don't have papers in that realm. We have many, many, many people and young people who are doing everything they can to make a better life in this country. They've been successful in business. They own homes. And there's no reason in the world for our government to spend time going after these people and deporting them. And we know that, in fact, there's no place for most of these families to go. They've been here most of their lives. They don't have family even necessarily wherever they came from before they came here. So I think that's an important thing. I happen to believe that it would be better if we had comprehensive immigration reform, but that wasn't in the cards. And I think what the president did, considering that it's actually limited and it makes government more efficient, so we don't have a need to go after people who really aren't causing a problem. Now, in terms of what's important, I think there are many, many pieces of this that are important, and that's really why you need it to be comprehensive, because it is about family unification, but it's also about allowing people who come to this country to work and to be able to even develop businesses within the context of better visas for a lot of them. And we have so many people who come here and they go back to, now other countries are doing better. We're losing talent every single day because they're not able to stay here because they can't get the protection. So all of that's important. And that's why we really have to do this in a better way. And the sad part about being in the Congress right now is there are people, and if we even looked at the votes, that occurred yesterday, because I think, if you take off people that are, well, not quite, because on the Democratic side you have really a total majority. I mean, everybody, I don't know of anybody who's opposed to it. But on the Republican side, we have a lot of people that are there, and just like the Speaker Boehner decided that he couldn't do this only with Republican votes yesterday, he needs to let the whole Congress vote. He needs to let the House vote. That's what he hasn't done. And if he lets the House vote, it'll pass. I can count on, I know the Republicans who would vote for comprehensive immigration reform, but they're not allowed to vote because he's trying to get a majority of the majority. And that's where the pressure has to come.
And I would like to ask, can you talk to us a little bit about your relationship with the president, but more importantly with the Democratic House members' relationship with the president?
We all believe that we have a very talented and bright president. I think there are some strengths that presidents have that help them engage better with the Congress politically. That is not what I would consider to be one of the strong strengths of this president. And that's a shame, because I think that what we saw yesterday is that the presidency and also, everybody involved in that, the administration, had to scurry to try and call and lobby members of Congress. This is only the second time since I've been there that I had a call from a high-ranking administrator in the cabinet. Only the second time. That doesn't, I'm sure if you surveyed everybody else, because they knew that we weren't necessarily with them. I was outraged, frankly, as were a lot of my colleagues, that the president weighed in when he did. We were trying to really use our leverage and our concern about these two measures in particular, and there were others, to bring the Speaker to do everything within his power to remove those elements out of this bill. And we thought that there were a majority of folks enough people on their side who were willing to do that. And unfortunately, the president, I'm trying to remember what time that was, it was pretty shocking, came out and basically said he'd sign the legislation. So what that tells me, number one, is he really wasn't aware of what was going on. So he didn't really know, and also he didn't realize how difficult it would be. Had he been more engaged all this time, maybe that was possible. It's not that he hasn't welcomed people into the White House, and done things like that, but he just has not had a great relationship with the Democratic side of the Congress. I remember George Bush did not have a good relationship with the Republicans when he was in office. They complain all the time about that. So maybe this is something that happens. We know that President Clinton, partly because of his great ability to engage with people, did a lot more of that. Certainly, we've had many presidents over the years, Johnson for one, who everybody knows is one of the keenest legislators and really understood the Congress and where the votes were all the time. I just honestly don't believe that the president, for whatever reason, has acknowledged the role that Congress has and that he's wanted to be a partner with it. There are those moments, but it's not enough, and he's really has relied on Vice President Biden to play that role.
But he was, don't you think that the president was brilliant on Colbert the other night? Maybe you didn't see it.
I heard of that.
Seriously, he was,
Yeah.
I thought if that's the president we could see more of,
Right,
meaning you.
exactly. That would be great. And I actually think it's obviously in him. And we've had moments with him, but it's not, a one-time or a two-time or three-time occurrence. I just think it's such an important ongoing role of any president in the country, because our job is to listen to people in our districts. How else? I mean, the president has this great bully pulpit; he can go around the country, but the people who are on the ground, most in districts throughout this country, really want to have an ability to share with him what their constituents need, and that's not something that we've had much opportunity to do.
Somebody pointed out that the president had played 185 rounds of golf with his chef, the White House chef. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. One point I wanted to point out to you was gathering of the young people to come in and their ideas. And if you look back on something like a celebrity show where there's a contest, they seem to draw numbers of people in, like American Idol. And my ideology on this for the younger people is it's very, very important for them to get into our government and look at things and not to be discouraged. And I know when this president ran, they had a great big bandwagon saying the younger people were out and they were behind them. And what they have to realize is that when the person gets in, he's still at the wit of the Congress and the Senate. And I don't want them to be disappointed if they were on the bandwagon and lost it. It's just a hurdle. You have to understand all the hurdles to get through. And so please, convince your people of your age to get into it, because the country really relies on you, okay? We're all going back out now, okay? I've gone through college, I've had my degrees, and I want the world to be better for you. I see how it was better. And the only thing I can tell you is it has to come from you. Don't be frustrated, don't be discouraged. Just try the best you can.
That's a great we have time we'll do two more. Dr. Braun, and then we'll end with this gentleman. Dr. Braun.
Two of the points. So you talked about this disillusionment in the voting booth, why people don't want to vote. And people don't want to do things, several reasons, but two of the best reasons is, one, a feeling of powerlessness. That's number one. What difference does it make? Why the hell should I vote for Republican in California? Because California is going to be a Democratic state. I think I'll go to work. That kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Another reason people don't do things. I don't get hurt. I don't stick my fingers in the wall with those two little plugs in there because my hair will stand on end and my heart will stop. I don't think I want to do that. That's punishment. Well, one of the things that we as voters, are up against, one is a huge problem, is gerrymandering. The fact of life is that our vote, no matter how well-meaning it is, may not count very much. If we're in a gerrymandered district, that regardless of where we put our vote down, it's going to be gerrymandered into another batch, another pot. Very frustrating. Turns people off like crazy. Another process, and that can be fixed. It's fixable. Kind of like immigration is fixable. It's fixable, yeah, try it. That kind of fixable. Difficult, taking time, requiring a political process, requiring give and take, requiring all this kind of patience. And the other thing is politicization. When something that is technically correct gets politicized, people get their politics in there. My voters, my workers, my laborers, my campaign contributions. That gets into the act. Good things don't work so well. One has only to look over the hill at the VA hospital or the other VA hospitals, because this one's pretty good, to know that. So we look at Medicare, $40 billion of probable fraud, let alone waste, every year. And it's being politicized, and representatives are calling the local people to tell them that even though this wonderful hospital in Texas, should be closed, okay? We don't want to close that because people work there. Well, both of those positions are correct. We want to really make it better. But there's a feeling of powerlessness and punishment. So when all of this comes out, the young voter, inexperienced in voting before but enthusiastic, may vote once or twice and say, the hell with it. And that is something I think that both parties, even the one that has more people disciplined than vote, and yours, so not to mention any names, okay, will sort of get together to try to work on those things. I think that you could get people in agreement with that. I think Republicans and Democrats could agree that government waste and government fraud should be seriously investigated and prosecuted. We all agree on that. And yet, how much of our budget is spent on setting up good regulatory, I said, what's that? So we had good regulatory, but let's say good regulatory, and good prosecuting for the people who really do criminal acts. So, these are the things I think that discourage people from going to the voting booth. And our neighborhood, as you probably know, having run into San Diego, the neighborhood of compulsive voters, like 97% of the people at Del Cerro vote. But whether it matters, we don't know. But we do know it feels good to do it. And I think with the young people, that all you can say is, you don't have to get a result today. You don't have to even get a result tomorrow. But just think about it. If it feels good, and it's the right thing, just trek yourself all the way over to your iPad or wherever and vote.
Good, thank you, Doctor.
Yeah. So can I just ask the young people that are here, do you agree with that? I mean, is the sense that knowing that you're making a contribution to the decision-making process in the country when you vote, does that matter, or is it something where trying to see the difference? Let me give you a real quick example, because student loan rates were at 8.6%. They are now at 4.3%. We are trying to bring that lower, and I'm trying to get rid of some origination fees. But, somebody did that. I mean, people had to come in, and I do think it had a lot more to do with side of the aisle that I'm on, to be honest, because I was there for the debates on this stuff. But, that makes a difference, doesn't it? Would that make a difference if you knew that those rates were changed? Because Congress actually used to control that interest rate. Now it's done more by the market rates. And so that, we're coming in closer to mortgage rates, although I think it should be something like 2%. But anyway, I'm just wondering, so would it make a difference seeing an association with something that you really care about to make you go back and vote if you saw that mattered? Or is it something that we don't quite know about? Anybody that we're missing? Yeah?
So you get time on television, come up and face the camera. We'll try to do better going forward.
Well, I think she's right. I think if people see something that they really care about, I think they're going to want to vote for that. So, I mean, maybe there's something else as well, but I think the main thing is if, the people see that if I vote for this person, X thing might happen, then I think they're going to want to vote. And that's really all I have to say.
Great, thank you. Somebody back here had a question. Oh, well, dear person, we'll let you have a question.
I just think as a retired teacher that it is a massive failure of our educational system that our young people are not taught that it's a responsibility of citizenship to vote. It seems it has to begin very early. Obviously in schools like this, there are civic courses and they are so taught. But I think in terms of public education in general, that's where the failure is.
Well, I think we would all like to see high-quality civic education in schools. And it isn't just lectures and books, it's really engagement. And there are so many different ways to do that. So that's really what we have to work hard on. I know there have been, actually, because I've been part of that effort in the Congress for a number of years, but it just doesn't really go anywhere. The state controls the education, basically. And there were bills when I was in the state legislature as well. I think it's just, we just don't see it throughout the country. And we should. We don't have enough teachers, I think, too, who not that they don't have an appreciation, I think they have a great appreciation for it, but they may not have had the kind of training to provide that kind of real quality, engaged learning on these issues. Yeah. I mean, it can also come from families, of course, but we have a lot of kids that, where that they really haven't had that history in their family.
We've got time for 2 more. Yes.
I just wanted to, as a history educator and civic educator, I just wanted to share a really interesting program that exists and that has been successful. And I know that Jonathan Schulman, who is here heralded and does an incredible job of doing this very sort of concept of integrating. The Annenberg Foundation has supported a project I was part of 10 years ago in New York City, which is called the Civic Education Project. And the goal was basically to get young people to revamp the civic education program so that kids are actually involved in their local government and are working on citizen action projects so that they can see how their local government works, actually how change is made, how difficult it is to make change, and then ultimately they feel part of this process, and it's resulted in, at least in 2 years in my time in Brooklyn, New York, a whole 2 class full of students that said they were all voting for the first time, and no one in their family had ever voted before, because they were involved in trying to get a traffic light up in Borough Park, New York, in a very challenging intersection. And so I think what Jonathan Schulman does here, and I think that what a lot of, I'm sure, teachers at Bishops do, and people need to do, educators around the world, particularly, educators in this country from my perspective, is to create these hands-on learning experiences where kids are integrated into local politics and local government and have an opportunity to see how they can possibly activate change and make change, and then as a result, that inherent in sort of ambition and connection and involvement, I believe will ultimately result in a generation of more civic-minded educators. So I think those sorts of projects supported by the Annenberg Foundation, supported by educators like Mr. Schulman and other folks around this country needs to be more, it has to be promoted. And a lot of that is happening. It's just in small pockets, probably.
Yeah.
So.
Well, wait.
That's good.
We're going to do a couple more. We've got about 5 more minutes.
Okay, so my question surrounds the Common Core curriculum, all right? So my question really is, what is the conversation in the Congress about the rollout of Common Core, which is a spectacular idea that looks like it's folding because of stupidity in the administration of the rollout?
I think the basic question is there hasn't been enough. There have been certainly presentations. The Education Committee, which should be all about trying to reauthorize the Early and Secondary Education Act, should have engaged with that in that arena, but hasn't really come up with a bill yet. And I'm not sure that they necessarily will. So I think it's there just hasn't been a very good partnership with the Congress on that. The Senate did a little bit better job, but their bill wasn't a whole lot better than what we should have been looking at. There are a lot of people who just don't believe that Common Core is a good idea, who are coming from states and communities that haven't been supportive of it, and so
haven't provided education for their kids
Yeah.
to get them through the military.
Yeah, no, it's a real problem. I honestly am not sure in the end. I think what we see here is that we have a lot of people that have embraced it. They know that there are some problems. There always are problems. The important thing is not to keep shifting around all the time, decide that we're going to do something and do it and stick with it and give people the confidence that it's worth working on it for a long period of time.
Let's go. I know. Come, dear person, come.
Takes a while.
So you can be on television. Tell us your name and the question.
Hi, I'm Sheila. My question is, what is your position on restrictions on the purchase and possession of guns? And why didn't Congress approve background checks for people before they can buy guns?
Thank you.
Well, my position is I believe we should have that kind of legislation. Actually, being a good friend of Gabby Giffords and many of the efforts that they've had, the reality is, again, you go back and you look at the country and you look at the states and you look at the traditions within states. What we have actually seen is we're going backwards on that. Polls now show that more people want to have guns. Now, there is some impact, I think, as a result of Ferguson and the feeling that people have that maybe people should be armed, that they don't trust law enforcement. I mean, that's an issue that's out there now, and I think it's one we obviously have to deal with. But the fact that we cannot eliminate the problems that we have in terms of having such loose laws that people can pick guns up just about wherever they want. When we have gun shows that have stricter laws, California's in a better place, but not around the country, because people, that's really not where they're coming from. That's not their tradition.
Yes, Mr. Master, will come to you.
Hi, I know you've been involved with veterans issues, and I would say that the VA has certainly had an embattled year. Would be interested in your thoughts on the future for the VA and maybe directions coming from the congressional side in terms of thinking about what the VA has been going through.
As someone mentioned earlier, I think we're fortunate that we've had a very active VA community here, and so in many ways, our veterans have provided the kind of oversight for our major facilities that doesn't necessarily occur in other areas. What happened in Phoenix, we have a local case actually that was affected by that, and it was tragic. So there's no excuse for what occurred there and in other places. I think that the Veterans Community, or the Veterans Committee, I'm not on that, I'm on Armed Services, but they have gone, I think, to great lengths to clean up that situation from their perspective. And I do think that we had a change. We had a great secretary in that role, but perhaps wasn't someone who was really willing to go to battle to be sure that people were doing what they should. And so I think there have been some changes. I'm hopeful. There was certainly money in this last budget in terms of suicide prevention and post-traumatic stress, dollars and research ongoing that we need. And I certainly hope in those areas, which are vastly preventable. Sometimes you can't do so much for the injuries that people have suffered, except to have really good care for them, which I think we have. But there is more we can do to make sure that people get the help they need immediately. And that's been the problem with the VA.
When you're a member of Congress and you're living and representing California, San Diego. It's a long ways from Washington. And the demands upon a member of Congress's time when they're home are very great. So I'm grateful to the Congresswoman for giving us this much time, but Mr. Masters, you're going to get the last question.
Thank you. Going back to the last election, which you started off here with, I have always wanted for the last several years to be able to ask a leader of the Democratic Party why they seem so inept at dealing with something as widespread as the legislative executive council. It seems to me that nothing has been done about this organization from the part of this party, and yet their influence on this last election is beyond huge. It's enormous, especially in local elections, and yet I have not seen anything from the Democratic Party. And these people have been around for several years now.
I think everybody would like to make sure that their activities are very transparent. That's been difficult to do, and that's helpful. I think we all know that when people can make up their own minds about what's happening, that we're all in a better position. And unfortunately, I think people just didn't realize the input that a number of individuals have had in writing legislation all these years. So it's not something that we're certainly aware of it. The ineptness, I think one of the things that I believe, and I think that we all believe after the election, is that we didn't sell the part of the economy that actually the Democratic administration has been so involved in moving forward. When you look at charts of the Obama administration as well as the Clinton administration, by the way, compared to other administrations, it's just off the charts in terms of what's happened. And we actually have to, of course we had to crawl out of a hole. But it's pretty significant, and now I'm hopeful that people will even see gains within, their own wages. That's the key, and to be in jobs in which they get those kinds of wages. So I think that's what we have to deal with. I think the way we counter ALEC and we counter other bad practices is to be far more articulate about what we have done that's positive. And frankly, I think that people ran away from the administration in this last election. They didn't embrace health care, and they didn't embrace the moves that had been made in terms of even a stimulus, which wasn't nearly as good as it should have been, but it made a big difference in a lot of areas, particularly in alternative energy arena. So we just, I think across the board, people didn't embrace those things, and people felt, that we must have not done anything that meant anything.
Your staff says we have time for one more. Here, come up and we'll ask the question. And while he's doing that, there are 5 Democratic Senate candidates, 2 incumbents, all lost, including Mark Udall, who's a friend. And all 5 of them ran away from the president.
Right.
Okay, I have seen that immigration has been a really big problem in the Congress recently, and I want to know your views on border security and the relationship the U.S. has with its bordering countries.
Thank you for your question. Actually, we need border security. I think people understand that. The reality is we have a lot of border security. I mean, San Diego, particularly California, and we've done that with multiple fences. We've done that with far greater numbers of law enforcement. The irony is that in the Senate immigration bill that was passed in a bipartisan fashion, had more money for border security than we've ever had. And yet they're turning that down. I just think it's a big excuse for not moving forward on something that has an economic necessity for our country. I think when you make the economic argument, it's clear. You take people who are working hard and give them the sense of confidence that they can do even better, they're going to do better. And they're going to make more money, and they're going to pay more taxes. All of that is true, and we have numbers to prove it. Well, I think that the issue around enforcement is, it's just another excuse. We have enforcement. The interesting thing is that here in San Diego, we know from our Border Patrol agents that fixing the San Ysidro port of entry is the biggest plus for border protection that we could possibly have. Because you allow people who have legitimate business every single day to cross this border in a timely fashion, and you're able to focus on those people who have business at hand that we don't want here. And we let our border agents focus on them, and they will take care of that as long as we don't have to send them after everybody else who's crossing the border. And we're doing that. There's actually money in this next budget to finish the San Ysidro port of entry, and that's a very big deal for all of us.
This has been a tutorial and incredibly valuable. And you need to remember that you've been privileged to be here and be a part of this, because there's a whole lot of people that just never have this opportunity and are therefore clueless. But this has been, as I said, a tutorial. Our appreciation to La Jolla Country Day, to Ms. Fox, to Mr. Schulman, and to all of you for coming. But most of all, let's appropriately end by thanking this wonderful member of the United States House of Representatives who does all of us honor, Congresswoman Davis.